What if the deadliest mistake a Viking could make had nothing to do with a battlefield? What if it happened in silence, in the dark, in the moment he lay down alone? We remember these people for axes and longships, for raids on distant coasts and voyages across water no one had mapped. But the thing that killed the most of them never carried a weapon, never declared war, and never once broke its promise to return. Every single year, it came back. Winter in Scandinavia did not attack. It waited. It took 1 degree at a time, so slowly and so patiently that a man could be losing the fight for hours without ever knowing the fight had started. Temperatures stayed below freezing for months. Wind came off the sea carrying damp air, and damp cold pulls the heat out of a human body far faster than dry cold ever will. And in the far north, the sun simply stopped rising, not for a day, for weeks. Families lived inside a darkness broken only by the glow of a fire. They survived it, generation after generation, not because they were stronger than everyone else, but because they had learned something we keep forgetting. You do not defeat nature, you negotiate with it, and the answer to how they did it doesn't begin with fire. It begins with the roof, and it ends somewhere you would never expect, with the exact place where you were allowed to lie down. Stand in front of a Viking longhouse, and you would not be impressed. Low, long, dark, half sunk into the ground, built from timber and dirt. It looks like something thrown together in a hurry. It wasn't. That low, gently curved shape meant the wind coming off the mountains slid over the building instead of slamming into it, and every layer above your head was doing quiet work. Birch bark. Then, thick blocks of cut turf, packed with millions of tiny pockets of trapped air. Which is why the snow that buried these houses every winter was never the enemy. Snow was the second blanket, laid down for free, and the deeper the storm outside, the warmer it got inside. In Iceland and Greenland, they took the idea even further, because out there timber barely existed. So they built walls of turf a full meter thick or more, walls that drank in the heat of the fire all day and released it back through the night. The house stopped being a shelter and became a battery. And that design worked so well that Icelandic families were still living in turf houses at the beginning of the 20th century. At the center of it all ran the long hearth. And here's the part people get wrong. It was not built to burn hot. It was built to charge the building. All day, the stones and the packed earth floor absorbed heat. And when night came, the flames were banked down into glowing embers under a layer of ash, safer, quieter, but the stone kept giving that warmth back until nearly dawn. There was no chimney. The smoke drifted along under the roof and leaked out through vents and gaps, ventilating the room slowly while it cured the timber, dried the fish and meat hanging in the rafters, and drove out insects. The house was breathing, and the smell of that breath got into everything, into wool, into hair, into skin. An entire civilization of children in the north grew up smelling like wood smoke and carried it as the smell of home for the rest of their lives. But inside that warm, dark room, not every spot was equal. There was one place along the benches nobody wanted, and there was another place that had to be earned by living long enough to deserve it. We'll come back to that, because it matters more than anything else in this story. First, there's a problem the house alone can't solve. A house can only hold the heat you already have. The thing that kept the heat inside a human body didn't come from timber or turf. It grew on the back of an animal. To us, wool is just fabric. Something you buy, wear a few seasons, and throw away. To these people, wool was money. And that is not a figure of speech. In medieval Iceland, a standardized woven wool cloth called vaðmál was accepted as legal currency. Taxes were paid in it. Debts were settled in it. Fines handed down at the assembly were counted out in lengths of cloth. Think about what that tells you. In the north, warmth was not a comfort you added to your life. Warmth was wealth, literally, the thing you saved and spent and could not afford to lose. And there was a reason wool beat everything else available to them. Each fiber grows with a natural crimp, a permanent wave that holds thousands of pockets of still air against your skin. And still air is what actually insulates you. Better than that, Viking wool kept much of its lanolin, the waxy oil from the sheep itself, which pushed water away instead of soaking it up. So even soaked through with snow or sweat, wool kept working. Linen, once wet, simply stopped, which is why nothing made of wool was ever thrown out. A worn cloak became a blanket. A blanket too thin to sleep under was unravelled back into thread and rewoven. The last useless scraps were jammed into the cracks around the doorframe to stop the draft. Every fiber was a small piece of heat, and nobody in that world was rich enough to throw heat away. Now look at where they slept. There were no bedrooms, no private chambers, no mattresses, just long wooden benches running down both walls. And by daylight, those benches were seats, workbenches, tables, the place a family lived. At night, they became beds, built up in layers. First straw, reeds, heather, or cut pine branches, trapping air underneath the sleeper. Then hides, and the most valuable of all was reindeer, because every reindeer hair is hollow, a microscopic tube of trapped air, thousands of them working at once. Then heavy wool on top. And one more detail that people always underestimate. Those benches were raised off the floor. Cold air sinks, warm air rises. So sleeping half a meter higher won you several degrees for free, without burning a single extra piece of wood. Everything in that room was designed, and still, all of it stacked together was not enough to get a family through the longest nights of the year. Something was missing, and it wasn't in the storeroom. What was missing was people. Every human body is a furnace that never shuts off, burning quietly all night long, and a person sleeping alone loses that heat into the dark and gets nothing back. Put several bodies close together under the same weight of wool, and something different happens. They stop losing heat and start trading it. The air trapped between them stabilizes, holds, stays warm hour after hour while the room around them goes cold. So a Viking family did not sleep together because the house was small. They slept together because that was the heating system. And here is the part I promised to come back to. The thing that tells you more about these people than any longship ever will. The order along those benches was not random. The elderly and the smallest children were placed toward the middle, where the warmth pooled and held. The strongest adults took the outer positions, closest to the wall, closest to the draft, absorbing the cold so it never reached the people behind them. Read that again. The worst place to sleep did not go to the weakest, it went to the strongest. That was not politeness, and it was not sentiment. That was a family, in the dark, deciding who would still be breathing in the morning. In their language, the word for household and the idea of the people who sleep beneath one roof were nearly the same thing. We would call that love. They understood it as arithmetic. Everything else followed the same cold logic. Outer clothes damp with snow or sweat came off before anyone lay down, because moisture pulls heat out of skin faster than cold air ever does. So they slept in dry linen under layers of wool and fur. It's the exact lesson Arctic soldiers are still taught today. If you want to stay warm, first stay dry. And then there was the last layer of heat, the one you couldn't see, because it was inside them. The evening meal was the biggest of the day, and it was built for a purpose. Stews of mutton and beef and goat, salted fish, dried fish, butter, cheese, marrow, fat, barley bread, porridge. Modern science calls what follows diet-induced thermogenesis. The heat your body throws off for hours, while it breaks down fat and protein. They didn't have the term. They just knew that the ones who ate well were the ones who woke up. And their oldest poetry says it out loud. When a stranger walked in out of the cold, what he was owed first was not gold, and not even a greeting. It was fire, food, and dry clothes. In the north, hospitality was never good manners. It was survival law, which makes what happened next almost impossible to accept, because the system was nearly perfect. Nearly. There were communities that did every single one of these things correctly, for generations, and vanished anyway. On the coast of Greenland, Norse settlers held on for close to 500 years. They had the turf houses. They had the wool, the livestock, the layered beds, the shared warmth, every single thing we have just described, and they did it correctly for 20 generations. Then the climate turned colder. The growing seasons shortened, and the ships from Europe came less and less often, until one year they stopped coming at all. What archaeologists eventually found were empty walls, no battle, no single catastrophe. And that is the coldest lesson in this entire story, because what destroyed them was not one freezing night, it was being left alone. Which brings us to the enemy nobody prepares for. In the far north, winter is not really measured in temperature, it is measured in light. Morning bleeds straight into dusk, dusk surrenders to another night, and the days keep shrinking until the sun barely clears the horizon at all. That kind of darkness does something to a mind. We have clinical names for it now. They had no name for it. What they had was a cure. When the heavy door closed against the wind, everything outside was silence and frozen field. Inside, the light of the embers moved across the faces lined up along the benches. The old told the sagas, again Odin, Thor, voyages to places that had no names yet. Women's hands never stopped spinning. Men's hands never stopped carving. Children fell asleep in the middle of a story they had heard 50 times. And those stories were not entertainment, they were evidence. Proof that winters exactly like this one had already been survived, over and over, by people whose blood was in the room. A people who refuse to forget their past are very hard to convince that they have no future. So look at the whole machine now. The house broke the wind, the turf held the heat, the stone gave it back. The wool sealed the body. The layered bench blocked the cold from below. The meal lit the furnace inside. And the bodies pressed together closed the circle. Not one of those things is remarkable on its own. Together, they are extraordinary. So why could sleeping alone kill you? Because warmth was never made by one person. It was held by the house, charged by the fire, wrapped in wool, and finished by everyone else. To leave the circle was to leave the system. Today, we have central heating, electric blankets, and a private room for everyone. We solved the cold. What I am less certain we solved is the other problem, because their strongest wall was never built from timber or stone. It was built out of people. And that is the war we lose most easily. Here at Dark Origins, we go looking for the forgotten wisdom buried inside ancient civilizations, because sometimes the most important thing about our future is still waiting in the shadows of our past.